Welcome back to the channel. After many months of putting it off, I have finally completed the install of the nose. Now in order to keep it looking beautiful, it must be epoxy coated. Now these last few weeks I have been putting in tons of work and getting a bunch of the rust removed on this bus, and if you're interested in that kind of restoration content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel as we have new episodes every Wednesday and Sunday. So let's get right into the work. After patching all the rust holes in the windshield opening, I was still left with a little bit of pitting, but nothing that would be too big of a deal or worth patching. So what I did is use the POR15 metal prep, got the rust neutralized, and then I'm going to be using the semi-gloss black POR15 in order to completely seal all of this rust. Now this is what I think is going to be my best option in order to provide the maximum protection from the rust returning. Now I like to use a semi-gloss one because I feel like it has better properties for the adhesion of the primer that's going to go over it. I might be wrong, and you're going to see that I will scuff it up anyways with the red Scotch-Brite, but typically you're not going to have good adhesion over something that has a glossy finish as opposed to a matte finish or like a flat finish. That is the reason I'm using the flat black one. But essentially, once the rust was neutralized, I coated everything twice as per the instructions of the POR15. And then once everything was completely dry, I went ahead and scuffed it with the red Scotch-Brite in order to get it ready for the primer. And the primer that I'm going to be using is actually the POR15 Self-etching primer. This is what they sell specifically for you to be able to tie coat the POR15 with any other paint. And in this case, I'm going to be using it to tie coat with the epoxy primer that we're going to be using on this. I have never tested this for longevity, but we're going to find out together if this is going to be a good solution or not. I've read reviews and it seems to be a good product, seems to work well, so only one way to find out, and you know, I like adventuring out. And I must say, after masking this windshield opening, it's a lot more difficult than I thought it would be. People make it look so easy on these paint YouTube videos. Masking is actually quite difficult, and I've got a lot to learn. If you're wanting a half-decent paint job like I am, then preparation is key. One of the first steps I like to take is blowing all the dust off with my air compressor and then moving on to using acetone to wipe everything down. Now do not use any rags with the acetone that have any kind of dye in them because it will transfer to your metal. I only use paper towels for that. Then I typically move on to using glass cleaner with a microfiber cloth. Now I got this idea from Paint Society. He seems to know what he's talking about, and he uses glass cleaner before he moves on to the wax and grease remover. And like I said, cleanliness and having a clean, grease-free, wax-free, dirt-free surface is what's going to give you the ideal paint job and the ideal adhesion. This is a self-etching POR15 primer that I talked about previously. It is, as the name says, self-etching, but I still like to scuff up the surface before I put it on to promote adhesion. I'm all about promoting adhesion. After all that promotion of adhesion, it was time to move on to the fun part, which is spraying the epoxy primer. Now I don't want to go too much into detail as I do have an episode that goes into detail about spraying epoxy primer, and the link will be above. But essentially what I'm doing here is using my 1.7 tip. I like to test spray it on that little paper that I have there, make sure I have the good spray pattern, and then I give it 2 light coats of epoxy primer. I let that dry for about maybe 4 to 6 hours so that it could get to the point where it's sandable, and as you can see, it is already looking quite nice. It's got a bit of orange peel, but that's going to get knocked back. But these areas where the A-pillar were welded on are not completely smooth, as I'm not really good at welding, you know, to where it comes out perfectly smooth. So what I like to use here is some fiberglass reinforced Bondo. The reason I like to use the fiberglass reinforced stuff here is that anywhere where it's going to be a little bit thicker, I don't like to use regular Bondo as it might crack in the future. And from what I've heard or read, it's going to do a better job at resisting cracking in deeper areas. Although none of these are really any deeper than maybe a 1/16 of an inch, maybe an 1/8 at max. One of the tricks with using this stuff is to not let it dry too long before you give it its initial sanding, as this stuff gets really hard and will eat through your sandpaper. After it's dried for about 30 minutes, I'll give it its good first initial sanding to get it close to the shape that I want, and then once it's completely cured, I'll go back over it by hand and completely smooth it to give it that shape that I want. And I think I was able to get the shape or the curve of the window opening close to perfect, or as close to stock as possible. And once it's all painted, I think it's gonna look great. Quite a few episodes ago, I replaced this longside rocker with the funky green panel, and well, I have left it unpainted for a long time, and bare metal exposed to the elements is a no-no. I don't want to get any surface rust. So there are a few areas here where I want to remove some rust. This seam needs to be completely ground down. You're going to see later how I get that done in order to use new seam sealer. My plan is to get this all down to bare metal because I think I'm going to get the best paint job that way, as there are quite a bit of little cracks and chips in the paint where rust got all the way down to the metal, and I don't want to paint over that before I treat it. So I'm taking this all down using my carbide disc, which in hindsight is probably one of the worst ways to strip a big panel like this. I should have used something more like the Eastwood SCT. I might look into getting one of these in the future, even though they are a little bit pricey, and I think Harbor Freight sells a cheaper version, but I'm not sure. I might check that out. But with enough perseverance, a carbide disc will get the job done. And once it was all done, I went ahead and used my blower to blow all the dust out of the garage, as it was tons of dust. And then I got my Navel Jelly and brushed it over any of the rust spots that had come through the paint in order to try to neutralize it. And my plan is to get rid of it, as I don't want any rust under my new paint job. None. Zero. While the Navel Jelly was doing its thing, I moved back to the nose of the bus, and the reason I'm going ahead and scuffing this down with the red Scotch-Brite again is because when you put layer after layer of paint, you start to lose the fine details in the curvature of whatever you're painting. So I'm making sure that this doesn't end up too thick, as I'm going to have to paint over some sections quite a few times, and that is why I'm making sure I bring it all back down to keep my nice defined lines. Now we're moving back onto the side of the bus, as now the Navel Jelly has done its thing, and we are going to begin to get the rust removed and get things down to about 40 to 60 grit with the sandpaper to promote, what is it? Adhesion. We love adhesion here, and we love promoting it. So we're gonna go and sand all this down, and then there were a few little rust spots that kept popping up that I had to continuously use the Navel Jelly on, but you'll see in the end we get all the rust out of the way, out of the panel. No more rust. Rust never sleeps, so we must kill it. On the body seams, what I'm using is just a regular wire wheel to try to get as much of the paint removed from the body seam, as like I said, we're going to be using seam sealer to replace the old cracking, failing seam sealer to get that perfect paint job. The paint job's gonna be so perfect you're gonna faint when you look at it. Somebody suggested to me that I try out this paint stripper, and it's cheaper than Aircraft Stripper Ultra, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Now, word to the wise, do not put this stuff in a plastic cup, as it will disintegrate right before your eyes. I went ahead and put it on some of this funky green paint and a little bit of the original Volkswagen paint and let it sit probably for about a couple hours, and well, this stuff sucks. So whoever it was that suggested it to me, you are dead to me now, and I'm never going to use this stuff again. It is nowhere near as good as Aircraft Stripper Ultra, and that's saying a lot because Aircraft Stripper Ultra still kind of sucks. But I wasn't going to let that hold me back, so I busted out the orbital sander and I began to work on getting the surface scuffed up and ready for epoxy primer. Now that all the little rust pits were gone, it was starting to look quite beautiful, but there still was this little spot where there were the 3 holes that the previous owner had, I guess, drilled out in order to take out a dent that I needed to fill with some weld. Now it's pretty simple to get this done. All I do is I use a little brass weight, hold it on the outside. This is going to absorb some of the heat from the welding process. If you have access to the inside of it, it comes out even cleaner. I will weld carefully without overheating the metal, and sometimes I use a little rag to cool it off, a rag with some water. And then once it's all welded up, I'll grind it down, and then using a wire wheel, I'll make sure that there's no oxidation or whatever that is that's left when you're done welding, because that could rust under your paint job. But as you can see, it was starting to look pretty damn good. At this point, I was getting pretty damn close to being able to epoxy prime it, but I wanted to make sure that I got all of this old seam sealer out. Now, I bought myself one of these tiny little wire wheels, which are actually kind of expensive. They're meant for Dremels, but it worked out perfectly on the drill. The only problem is it takes forever, and you eat through these wire wheels pretty quickly. But I've heard of people doing this with like an X-Acto knife or something like that, just kind of scrape it out. I think this is the best way to do it. but there's only one way to find out, and that is just doing it. We will be using some bare metal seam sealer on all these seams, and if you want to see how that's done, make sure to check out the next episode on Wednesday. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.